Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. This week I am speaking with Lydia Mashburn Newman, Managing Director of Monetary Economics at the American Institute for Economic Research. We're going to talk about Fed-driven inflation and how that might have helped Trump get reelected. We're going to talk about how cryptocurrency might actually put competitive pressure on all of that funny money that the Fed is flooding the economy with. And wait for it, will Ron Paul be the new chairman of the Federal Reserve in 2026? Check it out. Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. Lydia, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
So I discovered the other day at your conference, the American Institute for Economic Research was holding a conference on trying to get the Fed to be more rational in their policy prescriptions. And I discovered that you had joined AIER.
I have.
What exactly is your title over there?
I am the Director of Monetary Economics, Managing Director of Monetary Economics, which is one of three pillars that our organization is sorted into. Monetary economics is a huge component of even the founding of AIER, which started back in 1933, with sound money being one of the key reasons that our founder started at EC Harwood. So it's really exciting to join an organization that has been involved in ideas related to sound money for so long and that's interested in exploring these issues more deeply, while also trying to bring that topic. Monetary economics is not something everybody wants to approach, but one of our main drivers is to try to reach the everyman with a message about complex policy areas in a way that they can actually approach and understand and become better informed citizens. So I'm excited to kind of combine those two things, because you can get really wonky in the monetary field very quickly, and it can be very challenging to find ways of communicating monetary ideas in a way that's approachable. So that's going to be the work we have before us, and it's going to be a bit of a lift, but I'm confident we can do it. We've got some great people involved.
Dr. Harwood, John Harwood?
EC Harwood.
EC Harwood.
I think it's for Edward, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah,
Colonel EC Harwood.
Colonel Harwood, who founded AIER in the 30s because he was anxious about the destructive monetary policies. Things haven't gotten that much better.
I mean, one could argue, yeah.
It's almost like a boom and a bust.
That
happens again and again.
We have had many of these, and one could argue that throughout the U.S. Monetary history, we have had booms and busts roughly every 10 or so years. Arguably, they've gotten somewhat worse since the Fed, depending on how you look at it. So, yeah, we have continued to experience challenges with the business cycle in the U.S.
So I don't know where you are in this, but I'm going to argue that the spirit of 76 and the American Revolution died the day that Alexander Hamilton convinced George Washington to tax whiskey to start the first national bank. Am I wrong?
As part of an original sin, I could not necessarily disagree. The starting of our first national bank definitely had some crony incentives in it, and were not necessarily to the benefit of our nation. But as we know, the first and the second Bank of the United States, our first two central banks, both ended up disappearing. The first one, I think they just basically took themselves out of the picture by overinflating, causing crises, and then becoming insolvent. And the second one also created multiple expansions that hurt especially farmers in the 1820s and 30s. So both of those experiments with central banking were very unfortunate. And but the American people understood, I almost feel like they understood maybe not monetary policy as so termed, but they understood the value of money very well. And both of those institutions ended up being taken away.
That was one of the things that I thought was a little comical about the conference was that the more technocratic economists and policymakers speaking seemed skeptical and maybe even a little bit surprised that you called people everymen, that they noticed inflation. And it's like, do these guys live in some sort of theoretical bubble that doesn't expose them to the cost of groceries in a shopping cart, I guess?
Yeah, this is one of the things I was really grateful for Fed Governor Waller's conversation we had afterward, talking about some of his research, how when he was trying to decide when the Fed should raise rates after COVID, he started looking at things happening in the real world. And to me, that was a great example of somebody who's in this bubble saying, hey, let's look outside of this.
He actually said he went and talked to a businthman.
Yeah. And as he did mention...
A radical paradigm shift.
I know, like it seems crazy to talk to people on the street, or those running businesses. I do think there's a tendency in economics broadly in the sort of graduate level and research areas that the Fed is especially concentrated in. You can have a tendency to sort of get stuck in your model thinking. And I kind of, I get very frustrated by that, but I can't quite blame them because they're just like any of us. They're responding to incentives, and their career path and career trajectory all is geared toward writing in the literature, examining their models, playing with variables. But I'm always reminded, I went and sat in on an asset pricing class at the University of Chicago one time, and forgive me, I can't remember who the professor was, but it was like a 130-person class. And they were going through the models, talking about what happens if the asset prices change and what's going to be the outcome if you change the price of capital in this equation. And every single question from the audience was about the algebra. They weren't even talking about the calculus yet. It was just the algebra about moving with this variable from one side to the other. And I'm sitting there thinking, could we be asking the question of why has the price of that piece of capital changed, and think through the logic of how that might change how people behave? And that will lead you to the proper algebra, because math is just a tool to help you explain the world. And I'd like to say that that was the only time I've had that impression of maybe we're missing the forest for the trees, the forest for the models and the Greek letters. But it does happen very often. But it's the incentive that the academic research community faces. So yes, I was very encouraged when Governor Waller's like, yes, like go out and talk to people and see what they're experiencing.
Maybe because you were at the University of Chicago instead of studying monetary theory at George Mason University.
Well, so I wasn't actually studying at UChicago. I went to the College of William and Mary. I just was sitting in a class in UChicago. I have had the good fortune, though, of working with both Larry White and George Selgin. So I feel like I kind of got a private tutoring from each of them in monetary history and monetary economics. But there's definitely much more that I still have to learn, both in the monetary theory and in the monetary practice. But I'm grateful for institutions like Mason and the econ department that they've built out there. There's a lot of great younger scholars that have come up under Larry White's tutelage from there. Or you have David Beckworth, who has come up under George Selgin's tutelage, which I don't know if you heard the story where George actually failed David Beckworth on one of his preliminary examinations because he thought David could do better, not because he didn't pass. But
that seems mean.
It does, but George has very high standards.
George, yeah. And George will be on our show while he's here, and he spoke at your conference. Speaking of Austrian economics,
yes,
and there's a segue in here somewhere. We've been talking a lot about my old Grove City College professor and mentor, Hans Sennholz, who got his PhD from Ludwig von Mises when he came to the United States. There's this other guy that Hans Sennholz had a tremendous influence on. Maybe you've heard of him. His name was Dr. Ron Paul.
I have heard of this gentleman, yes.
Yes. And this is when I first met you. You were working on the Monetary Policy Subcommittee of the House Financial Services Committee. It's amazing. I remember that.
Yeah, I'm impressed.
Before Dr. Paul, how did you end up with that gig?
Yeah, that is a great question. So it was the Subcommittee on Domestic Monetary Policy and Technology. And they had separated out the international. It used to be monetary policy, both domestic and international was together. But when they realized Dr. Paul was going to, by they, I mean Republican leadership and maybe some of the Democratic leadership in the House, realized that Dr. Paul would end up as chair, a Congress before that, maybe two Congresses before that, they silently kind of moved the international part away because they didn't want Dr. No being in charge of the IMF and allocations for that. So like we have to protect that. Like he can't get into too much trouble just with Fed oversight. The Fed's strong enough, it'll be fine. But I've always found that amusing. But I ended up there. I had been at the Joint Economic Committee and I had grown up around the Hill, so I had a long understanding of public policy and how things worked on Capitol Hill. And so, but I had been at the Joint Economic Committee and had been devouring as much Austrian economics and other content on crises and business cycles. And then and some of that through Dr. Paul's work and the videos he was doing and the stuff he had done on the campaign trail. And it was one of those things where I was like, I can't believe he's going to take over this committee. Let me just put my resume in. Like, I had no idea. I was like, I'll take the coffee. Like, I'll do whatever, because I would just like to work with this gentleman. Also because he's just incredibly intelligent as a staffer. Usually you're plying your boss with talking points and educating them on whatever's the latest bill. It was always the reverse with him.
Most members don't know much.
Yes, but that's not the case with Dr. Paul.
Yeah.
And so I just put my resume in, and one of my friends happened to know his legislative director, Norm Singleton, who I think you know.
Yeah.
And I think I did like 5 rounds of interviews, and I sat and I didn't hear for like weeks, and I'm like, yeah, there's no way. They've got these, at the time, I'm relatively early in my career, although you could do a lot of great things very young on the Hill. And I was just surprised because I get this phone call, and there were recent PhD graduates from Mason who had been part of the in the queue, and it turned out there was one position they could hire, and it would be the point person for all of the oversight and activity work for that subcommittee. And then you get to rely on some of the full committee staff, but that wasn't that helpful necessarily given what we were trying to do in our subcommittee. But I got this phone call back from Dr. Paul's chief of staff, Jeff Deist at the time, and he's like, we want to hire you. And although he had first asked me, I think, an email question, what do you think were some of the worst things that set us up on a trend for the growth of government? And I think in my little naive, excited self, I was like, well, terrible things happened in 1913. We introduced the income tax and and got our central bank. So those are some of the parts where things started going wrong. But he had said that he chose my resume from the stack because of that government experience that I'd had. A lot of the other folks were great on the ideas, but he's like, we need somebody who can both run stuff, but also agrees with where Dr. Paul is. And then from there, we held more hearings in 2 years than the subcommittee had held in the previous, I think, 4 Congresses. We brought a ton of education because Dr. Paul's remit to me and one of his existing staffers, Paul Martin Foss, who's incredibly intelligent. We tag teamed it, and he's like, I want you guys to educate. And so all of our hearings, we had these really wonky titles. Like one of them was on parallel currencies. We had another one about fractional reserve banking. And we would do these hearings with these great witnesses who would never have come to the Hill before, hadn't been invited to speak on the Hill before. But then we also did these, we called them tea talks. We would bring people together. And you may have remembered some of those back in the day because we came and asked your advice on some of those. And we did those to help staffers, and sometimes Congress members would show up in an informal setting, just kind of giving them a brief lecture about what is money, like what is the Fed, how does it work, some really basic stuff. But you'd be surprised, especially then, this is many years ago, that level of knowledge on monetary economics, there was very rudimentary knowledge on monetary economics. And this was borne out. You would see Congress members asking the Fed chair questions about fiscal policy. That still happens today, but it happened almost all the time. And now today, you at least some members, and I remember some of those members when they were freshmen, those are some of the ones who are still holding the Fed the most accountable. And I like to think that what we did in Ron Paul's office, helped foster some of that knowledge and education.
The Free Life, Portrait of an Artist, is the new documentary by Free the People, the story of Cuban-born artist Carlos Luna, who fled socialism under Castro to find his free life in America. You can watch it exclusively at civil.com, civl.com, throughout the month of December for free at civil.com. Check it out. The story, I had forgotten the story about how the Republican leadership had sort of put Dr. Paul safely in this alley where he couldn't cause too much trouble because they had to give him some sort of chairmanship because of seniority.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to think back what within the Republican Party, I mean, forget the Democratic Party, but within the Republican Party, Ron Paul was considered an outlier, a gadfly, maybe even a nuisance for the serious people that wanted to do serious policy. But now, fast forward, you have Senator Mike Lee has introduced legislation to end the Fed. Maybe Thomas Massie has the House bill.
I think so. I think he picked up the bill after Dr. Paul retired.
Yeah,
he's been the one who's introduced
he's been
him and Justin Amash. I think
he's been carrying the torch. He's Thomas Massie basically is mini Dr. Paul, and I say that as a compliment. And Elon Musk is retweeting Mike Lee about ending the Fed, and he's tweeting about Hayek, and Dr. Paul is being consulted by the so-called Doge committee, both Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. So at the time, everybody ignored him and made fun of him behind his back, and now he appears to be having his moment where people realize perhaps part of it is going into this election, and I call it hyperinflation. I realize that's technically not right, but there's a lot of inflation that people are feeling in their pocketbooks and in their grocery basket cards. So people are going back to Dr. Paul and his influence in Austrian economics, trying to understand what to you and I might be sort of an obvious thing. If you create a lot of money out of nothing, prices are going to go up.
Yeah.
Crazy idea. So it's the Ron Paul moment.
I would say it's the Ron Paul moment 2.0 or maybe even 3.0, because I think the first one was with his, maybe him running for president back in the 80s, but especially his 2008 run was a huge awakening for a lot of folks in the midst of the financial crisis.
When was the Giuliani takedown?
Oh.
I mean, that was a foreign policy argument, but I think that was 12.
I think that was the 2008 cycle.
Okay.
I think. But then he then went back in 2012. And as he said, those campaign trails were all about using the platform. If you could win president at that time with his viewpoints, that would have been amazing, but very, very far-fetched. But it was the microphone that the presidential platform gives you that he used as basically to be an educator. He's maybe one of the best professors out there by the metrics of students reached. But I would agree that there is sort of this new resurgence and interest in how this stuff works and how to do it better. I'm excited that folks like Elon Musk and Vivek are being interested in this area. It probably shouldn't be too surprising that Elon Musk is, because his early days were in PayPal with Peter Thiel, and they have always had a slight, at least libertarian bent and understanding. So I'd like to think maybe some of the ideas of Hayek and Mises aren't necessarily completely foreign to them. The other thing is that it just is a very, the Austrian story of the Austrian economic story of the role of money, the history has sort of borne it out to be pretty correct. If you change the money supply away from the demands that the marketplace actually has, and that can be through changing interest rates or a number of tools you might choose to use. But at the end of the day, all the Fed actually does is create money. The truth of it is that it has to go somewhere. And if it wasn't driven by market demand for more money, like growth in population where you need more money to circulate, or change in areas of the economy where you need to direct more money, if it isn't demanded by the market, it ends up just driving prices up, and it doesn't drive them up evenly. And that, I think, is what a lot of the American people have been feeling. They've been feeling a lot of pressure, especially folks who are in the middle to lower incomes. They didn't get the benefit of the COVID money printing with the massive increases in the size of the stock market. They've been left holding the bag of higher grocery prices, higher housing insurance prices, higher rents, higher car insurance. And those are just this year. And these aren't the prices that led to higher prices back when we hit 9.1% inflation. So the Austrian story, it's not a story. It's grounded in reason and fact. And unfortunately, throughout our modern history, we have had great examples of how things go wrong when you mismanage money. And so I think that's both hopeful because it means people have an interest in maybe learning a bit more about why that's the case. And I'm hoping that folks like you and maybe folks like my organization can take advantage of that interest, that moment, if you will, to help provide more of that knowledge to say, hey, the money issue actually does matter.
Yeah, the Mises' story of the business cycle, which obviously was developed by Hayek as well, seems to play out again and again. And their unique understanding of money is not a creation of government, but a creation of exchange and people just trying to figure out what was a reliable medium of exchange that emerged spontaneously through exchange. And then government comes along and screws everything up. So when we talk about fiat currency, it's not just a joke. It's like, this is not real money. This is the printed money that governments pretend is real, and you're forced legally to use it.
Yeah. And the history on this goes back, centuries, millennia, maybe, like back to Diocletian in the, ancient civilizations where governments really appreciate the ability to take over money because you can then, I guess, to put not too fine a point on it, to debase the money to give themselves more purchasing power. But the end results always end up being the same. The people end up suffering because the value of their labor that they get in exchange for this monetary medium goes down, and they are worse off at the end of the day. And so this idea that you can just change the thing you're using to exchange and not have any consequences, especially if you're making more of it to benefit your own pockets, you can't. The history says this does not turn out well. And I think it's amusing, sadly, that, you've got to laugh so you don't cry, that governments continue to kind of abuse the privilege of having a monopoly on money. And they've always also, of course, throughout history, been very quick to take over that monopoly on money and to quash any sort of private market-derived money. But we've had lots of examples throughout history. I mean, money itself, based on a number of economic viewpoints, but especially among the Austrians, is that money itself is something that has emerged on the market. It's something that we as individuals trying to exchange with one another developed in order to make that exchange easier. So there's no reason that a government has to issue this money that we use. In prisoner of war camps, we would decide to use cigarettes, or we've used tobacco leaves, we've used salt, we've used all sorts of things. Anything that is, easily divisible, relatively good store of value, and can be widely accepted. These are things that have served as money in society. And so the idea that government has to be the one to issue it, or that has to be the one that manages it, is actually, in the whole course of human history, not necessarily always the case.
And I want to take it to our current situation, because it is always used as the means to finance things that arguably government shouldn't be doing in the first place. Most famously war, but I have argued, and it seems obvious to me, that there is no way that policymakers in the United States or even globally could have locked down the world without the ability to just create money out of thin air, because that's how they financed it, and it created this horrible new class war, haves and have-nots. The laptop class, the people that benefited most from the inflation. Mises calls them injection points, but it's basically like the investment bankers are able to play with that money first and make money out of the fake money, while those of us that are actually holding it in our wallets are getting screwed the entire time. Without a Federal Reserve Bank, they would not have been able to lock down the economy. And if they hadn't locked down the economy, they would not have been able to trample on our economic and civil liberties. So it's not an inconsequential thing. But you wrote a piece recently that you apparently didn't even know had been published yet, that argued that perhaps totally inadvertently, the Fed and Jerome Powell did Donald Trump a solid by overinflating the currency and driving double-digit inflation, particularly in groceries and rent and things that people actually notice.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting story. I try to caveat that it's not that Powell and the folks at the Fed did it on purpose, but by them first. And there are arguments for, okay, if we had lockdowns, then we needed to backfill it with monetary policy. And I can understand that from an economic standpoint, what that meant to balance out. But really it was the Fed when things started opening back up and the Fed needed to at least stop pumping money into the system, it failed to do that. And so by delaying a policy tightening for too long, it ended up fueling the inflation that we saw. Now, there are lots of arguments like, can the Fed fine-tune the economy? I think it's trying really, really hard still to do that and engineer its soft landing. And maybe it's improved its tools somewhat, but I do think that the power of money printing is a momentous one, and you need to be very cautious about how you use it so that you don't misuse it. And I think that the Fed very much so in not paying attention to, I think, they ignore things like monetary aggregates. Those are out of fashion in the economics profession now. Like, how much money is there really sloshing around the economy? And then there are other more technical metrics they could have been paying attention to, like total spending in the economy, which, as you heard in our conference, was a huge part of what we were talking about, because it's a very simple shift from what the Fed is already doing just to help them do it better. But as you say, arguably, it's like, all of these things that the Fed enables, is the benefit they're supposedly providing us really worth the poor incentive structure that it's creating, especially for the government, but maybe the economy writ large? And these are some fundamental questions that I think a lot of people are still a little hesitant to go that deep, because I remember early on in my Ron Paul days, like when you start talking about like, well, who is controlling the value of the money, it makes people very, very nervous. They don't want to talk about some of those fundamental questions. But when they have noticed that their paycheck literally goes, like every $5 they spend, they really are only getting $4 worth of things they used to get in the aggregate. And then when they go to buy their car insurance this year, for example, I think some rates have gone up as much as 47%. And that's like a year over year. So these are the fundamental costs that the populace is facing. And I think it's very, very concerning that, when you're up in the ivory tower, it's like, oh, well, the average inflation rate, we're getting down in the 3%-ish to 2%-ish range, or 2.5%-ish range, depending on how you're measuring it. So things should be fine. But it totally ignores that this is a change over multiple years. That 2 to 3% window is just, it depends on where you pick your averages, like what dates you pick. But as an individual, you have a certain amount in your paycheck, and it takes a lot to try to increase the amount that paycheck brings you. But if everything you're buying, from the roof over your head to the food on your table, is up at least 20% or more, that's a real problem.
So I was thinking at this conference, I was wondering, and you probably know who's made this argument, but I was thinking of the critique of John Maynard Keynes, who argued that the government should spend more money during a recession to drive aggregate demand and lift us out. And there were two critiques of that. One was, the Hayek critique was, you don't know enough to manipulate the economy from the top down. And then sort of the James Buchanan critique, which is, it's easy to spend money that you don't have. But the other half of Keynesian theory was to actually cut spending when things were good. And that second half doesn't happen.
We forget about that second half, conveniently.
And it seems like the political incentives at the Federal Reserve and all of the implicit and explicit political pressure is to have easy money, more money, particularly since like things have not been good by any actual measure that matters since lockdowns. Is there some sort of critique that argues that the problem with the Fed, assuming that they have the knowledge to actually manipulate the economy the way they do, and I don't think they do, but if they did, sure, easy money during crunches, but there seems to be no tightening. It's a one-way street.
Yeah.
And there was some talk about that, like when they go below 2%. I don't know why 2% inflation is a good number, but apparently it is. When they go below it, they're quick to flood the market with new money, but when they go above it, they don't respond conversely.
Yeah, there's definitely a bias toward more inflation. I think central bankers have scared themselves silly about the consequences of deflation, but and so they always want to be at least somewhere above zero. But historically, our economy in the U.S. has performed better when there's been a slight deflation, meaning that things are getting more productive so that every dollar actually goes further. But part of the Keynesian argument, like in his general theory, is that a lot of it has to do with the psychology, is that you want to add money to the system and try to hopefully prop up wages, at least not in nominal terms, so that people feel like the economy is not performing so poorly. And I always feel like it's a little bit papering over the real problem as a recommendation from the economic theory. It's like, so you're making people feel like there's more money and their wage is larger nominally and like the total dollar number they're getting, but if it's buying them fewer goods, at the end of the day, they're still worse off. So I think it's a little bit...
and leads to fundamental misallocations of resources.
And this is where I think the insights of the Austrian school are so important, is that that money, when you do have new money, there are two important things. One is that if the money is created by the government, there's new money, it has to go somewhere first, and it's choosing to put money where it thinks things are most important. And if you at all believe in the allocative power of markets, it by definition must be going to something that markets have chosen is not valuable to society. So it inevitably has to be going in a direction that doesn't actually lead to optimal societal outcomes. And that's one of the insights of Austrian economics that I think is incredibly powerful and would love to see some more work done there. But so having the money, so that's like the first problem, but as the money flows throughout the system, it is continuing to go into areas that are not necessarily the most optimal. And so that component of, I guess getting back to the Keynes story of like, well, why can't we allow it to decrease sometimes and not others? It seems very much that they're to actually have it shrink, it goes counter to that original idea that, oh, we want those nominal wages to go up. That makes people feel good. Everyone hates when they think that their wage is actually going down. And so central bankers don't want to like cut the money supply per se, because you would have to have an adjustment of wages. But part of the Austrian school insights are that, especially when you go through a downturn, this is actually something my husband has argued, and sometimes we get in arguments about this, and he has a paper coming out about this, that he says one of the benefits of Austrian business cycle theory, or the idea of where you would want things to contract in the economy, it can actually speed up recovery and allow for the price of, allow for the money to get where it went into the bad areas to get squeezed out faster and lead to a better, like getting to that real foundation sooner so that you can recover, your recovery can be more robust. Government officials don't subscribe at all to the Austrian business cycle theory, and their goal is to make sure the downturns don't happen. The Austrian business cycle says that the downturns are actually the healing mechanism from having inflated the boom, and that the real problem among policymakers is they don't realize that their original error was in trying to inflate the boom to begin with, whether it was in counteracting a contraction, but usually very often they accelerated an expansion way beyond the productive capacity of the economy based on the resources we have as a society and based on where we as actors in the marketplace decided resources should go. So a lot of it is, at the end of the day, it's you're creating a dislocation between what you might think is ideal from from your vantage point from the ivory tower compared to what do the individuals choose with their everyday transactions. And sometimes policymakers, they focus on that ivory tower side of it of, we can manage this and we can create prosperity in perpetuity. And if that is their vision of prosperity is different from what society demands, inevitably it's going to lead to dislocations. So I think there's a lot to explore there to help the people realize they actually have a lot of power in the economy and not to think that the policymakers can just smooth out all the bumps along the way.
Regular viewers of Kibbe on Liberty already know how obsessed I have been with the pandemic industrial complex and all of the stupid, authoritarian, and downright evil things that the government did to us during COVID-19. Well, I'm proud to announce a new investigative series that looks to get to the bottom of all of that. It's called The Cover-Up, and I'm producing it in cooperation with BlazeTV. The only place you're going to see this is BlazeTV, so go to FauciCoverup.com/Kibbe and use the code FauciLied for $30 off your annual subscription. Do it now. The truth is out there. There's also and I always filter every single policy question that I ask myself or someone asks me through two basic filters, and they're quite helpful, particularly if you don't happen to know all the details. One is, do they have the knowledge to do the thing they're trying to do? And the other is, even if they did have the knowledge, do they actually have the incentives to do the right thing? And part of the story you're telling, there's a raw political calculus that pain doesn't sell, and that insidious transfer of wealth that comes from inflating the currency. They're all hoping that in the long run they're all dead, to quote Keynes, or at least in the long run they can blame the Fed or they can blame somebody. If you're Elizabeth Warren, you're going to blame greedflation. She's never explained why they weren't greedy before greedflation, but that's perhaps a flaw in her theory. So there's, to me, the incentive problem is in a lot of ways bigger because the pretense that they actually know something is really just an excuse to do things that benefit them at the expense of the rest of us.
I think
maybe you're not that cynical.
I have been that cynical in the past, but I try to give people benefit of the doubt. I do think that they're responding to the incentives that they're facing, and many of them genuinely think that they're trying to do a good job of managing the economy. I do think they have it's fundamentally an education issue where that humility and knowing that your knowledge is limited is actually a hugely powerful component. And I think sometimes that can be very lacking among the intelligentsia and the policymaking community. So having some humility about how much you can actually do in the policy realm, I think, is incredibly important. But one of the things about the inflation, just to go back to that a little bit, in the COVID environment you were mentioning, is that a lot of the policymakers and academics, even today, they've been saying like, well, the economy seems so good. Why are the people so upset by this? And they're looking at all these averages between, that's like, oh, we're close to 2%. And a lot of the literature says that in general, most the labor force is kind of okay with about a 2% inflation. But when it gets above that, 2 to 4%, there's been an interesting paper, I think it's by Jonathan Hetzel and some co-authors from NBER, where they talk about one of the reasons why the people get so frustrated with inflation they're okay with it up to a point. They can kind of manage up to a 4% increase, adjust their paycheck, adjust their budgets, and reallocate things. Maybe cut out movie night, cut out date night, cut out the organic, free range, non-grain fed, or what have you, eggs, and go back to your regular eggs. But when you get above that 4%, that's when people start to have to behave and change their behavior even further, including having to go through tough renegotiations to get higher wages. Maybe they have to go into job switching. So a lot of the economists, I think, have ignored some of that. So I was glad to see this paper come out. To a normal person, this makes sense, right? Like, as soon as prices get high enough that you have to change your job, you're going to be pretty unhappy, right? So it's kind of funny that, like, sometimes the academics, this is, again, where they're not focusing on people and they're focusing on their models. Like, that.
Why are people too stupid to realize that the aggregates are fine?
Yes. That was kind of been the impression. And right after the election, that was one of the components as well, where a lot of macroeconomists were surprised. Like, why were the people so upset by inflation? It really wasn't that bad. But when you dig down and beneath those aggregates and, like, put yourself in the position of an ordinary person, every single person has had to make, who is especially in a middle or lower income, has had to make real changes. And so it goes back to that, like, please observe the real world in which you're in and not just your models.
Particularly people at the margin. And it's fascinating to me that, all of these interventions are always wrapped in language about caring and making sure that the government is protecting people. But of course, the opposite is true, and it's particularly true if you're not a member of the laptop class. Like, if maybe you had no give in your family's food budget. I think your paper said that food. Correct me, but it's on average it went up 20%, but
26%.
26%.
26% since the pandemic.
So 1/5 of the family budget.
Yes.
And the economists tell us that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Talk about this. Like, you're just so people understand. At the start of the lockdowns until today, the Fed has injected $5 trillion in new money.
Something like, went from 7 to. Yeah, I wish I had my numbers on me, but yes, it's been a 40.
A trillion here, a trillion there.
Yeah,
it starts to matter.
I remember when it went from roughly 1 trillion before the financial crisis up to 4 or 5 trillion, and that was huge. And now we have this even higher amount, up to 12. I guess it went up to 12, but it's been a 40% increase in the money supply overall, and their balance sheet has grown significantly.
And the impact on cars and rent and food.
Yeah.
So it's a big number.
So it's a 26% in food and in housing. And the interesting thing about the housing stuff is that that is a lagging indicator in many instances, where a lot of, especially for rents, a lot of those contracts are for 1 year, 2 years. And so we're having contracts renegotiated today that are, or leases renegotiated today that are just now factoring in some of the price increases from 2 years ago. And so, or even further back. And so Chair Powell appropriately but somewhat coyly referred to these as catch-up costs in his last two press conferences, because it's especially among rent and in house insurance and car insurance, especially car insurance. I think I mentioned up like something like 47% in some regions over the year. So, and I'm in Florida. I live in the one of the highest insurance, car insurance areas, as well as homeowners insurance. And homeowners insurance is also up about 25%. So, but you're talking about, this is a quarter to 50% of large swaths of every person's budget. Like, I don't know if you've done, one of my pet things is I love personal finance. And so I love watching like regular folks and their budgets. And it's actually very illustrative for studying monetary economics. But they're having to make, like, you change your grocery budget and your housing budget and your insurance budget, each one, even if they're only on average 20%, and most Americans, 78% of Americans are already living paycheck to paycheck. Where do you find basically an extra dollar for everything that you buy? And that just becomes very, very challenging. And then and finding, and then one of the things economists like to say is, oh, well, but wage growth has sort of kept up with this. It's only been, depending on how you measure it, like if wage growth has been strong, then therefore that should make up for the inflation. But this gets back to your laptop class thing. I need to dig into the numbers more, but the way that I'm seeing it is that wage growth happens very largely in more white-collar jobs than it has in other jobs, like you had with the strikes from some of the labor unions, both at Boeing as well as the North Shoreman strikes. They're advocating a 40% increase in their wages, which is actually appropriate given the amount of the amount of the increase for overall money supply, and they're maybe trying to price in that wage increase because they're locked into a contract for a number of years. So if inflation surges back up, they're trying to protect themselves. But that has all these knock-on effects in the economy where you all of those negotiations, it's like there's just like another round of adjustments in prices. And so like once you start this thing, it just keeps going. Yeah. And so I would argue like, let's try not to start these things again.
So the president, who should be maligned much more than he is, Woodrow Wilson, creates the Fed in 2013 based on a proposal from a cabal of bankers who go off to Jekyll Island and come up with this sneaky secret plan. Originally, the Fed had more oversight through Treasury than it does today. Fast forward to, I can't tell if this is a media created firestorm or if Donald Trump has actually hinted at firing Jerome Powell and or ending the Fed. I see these things on Twitter.
It's like what's true, what's not.
I don't know if it's true or not. But everybody has now seen Jerome Powell. I guess the question was, can the president fire you? He's like, no. No. Do you know who I am? And I'm going to get you in trouble because I know you have to work with these guys. I don't. But the counter argument coming from people like Senator Mike Lee is that there is no constitutional authority to create the Federal Reserve in the first place. So the practical question is, Trump is president-elect. He's coming back in. It's not all clear how he's going to tackle inflation. What does he do? Can he fire Jerome Powell?
Based on the law, and Powell did emphasize this, you cannot, the president does not have the ability to remove the head of the Federal Reserve. Maybe, I think there might be a stipulation for cause, but that bar is very, very high. So technically speaking, I do not think that the law allows for the president to remove him. That doesn't mean that he can't try. It doesn't mean he can't put political pressure to try to get Powell to resign. Powell has been quite adamant that he's not going to resign, and if asked, he would not. He's going to serve out his term. His term does expire, though, in May of 2026. So we're talking about, a little more than a year.
So Ron Paul, incoming Fed chairman, just to bring the circle back together.
Very much so. That I wonder if he would be willing to serve in that capacity. I think this is part of the problem is you'd have to get folks on the Senate on board with some of these more radical types of outlooks on things that in DC I feel like there's this great tendency toward path dependency, and they think that the status quo is okay. So it goes back to that education. Like to get someone like Ron Paul approved to head the Fed would be quite a feat.
Well, the senators are all part of the system, so it's even less than unlikely. But it's fun to talk about.
Yes, yeah. Now it does say though that there needs to be like that pressure though can still bring its own sort of accountability, even barring removal. In fact, the Fed likes to, or even economists generally like to talk about the value and importance of independence of a central bank because you don't want your political apparatus to try to inflate, especially in order to benefit politically by having easy money for a period that makes people feel wealthy. This was, back in the Nixon days where Nixon pressured William McChesney Martin to print more money so he could win re-election. These are real concerns, but to presume that they don't happen anymore, they maybe don't happen as blatantly as that anymore. One argument I've heard is that Chair Powell may have, or people speculate or wonder, that was Powell late to take the Fed in the direction of tightening back in the 2021-2022 period, because he was up for reappointment and wanted to be chosen over someone else who was viewed as being a possible Fed contender, Lael Brainerd, who was also on the Fed board at the time. So to say that the Fed is independent, I think, is a bit of an overstatement. I think everyone is subject to political pressure, societal pressure, peer pressure, and also just the incentives that you're facing. So, even though there are debates about, is there constitutional authority for Congress to have delegated the monetary power to the Fed, it is very much the case that Congress is still ultimately responsible for that. And the fact that they have delegated it to the Fed sort of almost wholesale is a bit, I would argue, somewhat of a dereliction of their constitutional duty to hold the Fed accountable.
So how would you, so I was thinking about this, and there was a presentation, a professor, I can't remember her name, about the history of the tension between congressional oversight of the Fed versus so-called Fed independence. I didn't even know anything about Jerome Powell, but I wikied him this morning, and I'm sure this is true of all Fed chairmen. They're bankers, so they're clearly their incentives are defined by their interests, and I'm not maligning them specifically. Everybody, this is the entire public choice theory, is that we all have personal interests, and they don't leave when we take a public position. Versus, congressional jawboning to keep the money flowing. I don't think there's a better answer. Like, I don't want to give all the power to the so-called independent bankers who have their own incentives to do things a certain way, and I don't want to give all the power to Congress because it seems like their incentive is almost the same. Everybody's pushing for easy money. Nobody's looking for the fiscal austerity that would actually get us out of the business cycle. So, do you change the mandate? What can we do to rein in the Fed? And this will upset everybody watching this show, but let's take ending the Fed off the table.
Well, we can leave it. It's there. It's an option.
Okay, but I think I've always more ascribed, like I never exactly knew how you would end the Fed, given that the entire system and everybody in power feeds off of that system. It seems hard to do, if not impossible to imagine. But this famous, all the crypto bros love this old Hayek interview that he gave about the time he released the book, The Denationalization of Money, where he's imagining he's frustrated, like the boom bust cycle is just destroying Western civilization and destroying the economies and all the things that we know that it does. But he's like, I don't think we can get rid of the central bank, but maybe we can come up with some sort of sneaky workaround. And maybe that's keeping the federal government and senators like Elizabeth Warren away from destroying the emerging crypto markets that could in fact offer a competitive alternative to funny money coming out of the Fed.
That's a lot. There's a lot there to unpack. Hayek's Denationalization of Money is an incredibly informative piece. It's actually fairly short and pretty easy to read. It's not crazy.
Unlike most Hayek.
Yeah. Although Hayek, compared to Mises, although I prefer Mises probably, but some of Hayek's, like Road to Serfdom, is very easy to read. Although actually, I did have somebody tell me once that, Lydia, you're not normal, so maybe you shouldn't be the one judging what's easy. But the denationalization of money is, I think, an incredible insight to how to change something without having to tackle it head on. And if you look at most of long-lasting societal changes, they almost always seem to come from a gradual change in what people do. Those stick with us. I like the example of Uber, in fact, where it's like we got used to this taxi medallion system, and then this company innovates and gives you access to something, and at first it was somewhat of a privilege for people to use it, but then it has replaced the taxi system, right? And so the idea behind denationalization
I
of money...
still have industrial organization books that tell us that can't be done, right? It was impossible to imagine that the taxi monopoly would go away. And then
it didn't go away without a fight, and
Right.
it's not technically completely gone.
It's not gone, but it's-
from a consumer standpoint, we and then there's the argument that that Uber just became the new taxi system and takes advantage and isn't. But I disagree with that a little bit. I think it's still on net a benefit from the system we had before, especially the information sharing. But I always think of that as an example of what does it really look like to have an alternative currency, and would that be the way, as Hayek was mentioned, of trying to get out of the boom bust cycle by allowing people to slowly and gradually adopt another option, or even just to have options, right? And so back in my Ron Paul days, one of the pieces of legislation that was always introduced was our parallel currencies amendment, which seemed a little nicer than saying denationalization of money or competing currencies. People didn't like the word competing, so we were looking for something more friendly. But you see what's happened in the crypto market is, one, just the emergence of something that allows other people to use an alternative medium. I mean, you can use other nations' currencies, but part of the challenge, at least in the U.S. market, is, one, it's great that we have something people could choose, like Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency. I personally somewhat agnostic, like let people use whatever they want to use this money almost. Maximum freedom leads to the best outcomes overall. Takes time, can be a little messy, but in the U.S., we do have serious barriers, especially our tax code, that prevents us from using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, because of the capital gains taxes you have to pay on what is now viewed mostly as an asset. Basically, you have to pay tax every time you exchange it if you exchanged it at a higher value than you paid for. So we have the computers to run that taxation. Like, you can do that. But on a day-to-day level, a person isn't going to want to have to calculate their capital gains tax every time they try to use something in they're just not going to use it in a transaction. So that does have it has a dampening effect on the network effects of a cryptocurrency. But we are still using types of cryptocurrency as means of payment. And the question about whether it could be full money is still outstanding. Without changes to law becomes a big question.
I have to dig into this, but a lot of the tech bros, Mark Andreessen was talking about this on Joe Rogan the other day. The debanking is an issue for crypto companies that want to sort of fill that gap. Yeah. The SEC and Gensler have been a fundamental block. And what is it, the CFPB? The
CFPB. They haven't waded as far into the crypto space yet. I think the SEC is trying to stake out that claim, and has with Gensler's leadership. But a lot of that has to do with
he's already tendered his resignation.
He has said, and this is typical for multi-headed agencies, except for the Fed, which I find fascinating, where you have a commission, especially ones that are divided between political parties, like the SEC. You have to have a majority can be from the administrative party, but you need to have at least two commissioners from the other. So him resigning is actually quite typical, and so then President-elect Trump, and when he becomes president, will have the opportunity to appoint a new chair, and that gets into a lot of the difficulties with, like, should we be regulating crypto as securities? It's very unclear what the SEC's rubric is. They're using the Howey test, which is very unclear in itself about what counts as a security, and not every crypto is the same. And then on top of it, you have Gensler and the SEC, although this is a tactic also used by the CFPB, where it's a lot of regulation by enforcement. I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of the rule of law and transparency, so people know what the rules of the road are, especially in advance of taking an action. At the SEC and many times the CFPB, they say, well, we can't tell you if this is a security or not, but if you're going to do this, you're going to get this enforcement action.
Yep.
And they just quash innovation. And that to me is like the longer term, like that stifling.
It's like regulation by implied threat. Yeah.
Yes. We call it regulation by enforcement because it's through the enforcement arm of the agency. And that is not the way to make law. And I think Congress has a duty to try to actually clarify the SEC's role and work as well. And there is some legislation milling about on the Hill to try to clarify the regulatory treatment of crypto.
I think there's a good reason to be optimistic that the Trump administration is going to take a very different approach on this stuff for both economic reasons and political reasons, because the endorsements of not just Musk, but the tech bro community, and I think they did it out of frustration. I suspect a lot of them probably started off thinking that they were Democrats, but they were so getting screwed by these alphabet agencies that they decided to find a different path.
Yeah. And once you've been through the ringer as many times as some of these folks have, like it's not surprising with that change. One of the other challenges, though, that will be faced outside of the SEC component and that crypto also faces is access to the existing payment system, if you will. The Federal Reserve is in charge of all of the master accounts that allow for banking services to feed into the rest of the financial system. And you've had several cases, including Caitlin Long in Wyoming, trying to get access to the Fed's master account where she's just a custodian of some crypto assets, and so that they can transfer payments through the system. And she's been well, it's not just the master account for her, but it's also just being able to get what she needs as a charter. But it's very the government apparatus is very negative on crypto becoming more mainstream, if you will,
because it's a cartel.
Possibly.
So give us some shameless self-promotion for your work, the work of AIER, and where we find out more about this stuff, because I feel like we all have to become, despite what the macroeconomists want, we're all going to become experts on monetary policy. Yeah.
And we all can become experts.
Yes.
Do not underestimate what each person can learn. So we are at AIER.org. American Institute for Economic Research, but AIER. I know that can be a mouthful, but we have on the site, you'll see we have our monetary economics pillar. Encourage you to go there. We also have what's called our Sound Money Project, where we've got a group of academic scholars who are working on some heavier hitting intellectual work. But in the next year and some, we're going to be working on a lot of publications, some short form work, one of which I'm excited to work with my colleague Paul Mueller on about like a monetary policy sort of primer, like understanding how money works. Not that we need more of those, but I do think actually we kind of do, because you got to meet people where they're at today. So I encourage people to keep coming back to our work there. I'd like to be able to say you can find me on Twitter, which you can, but or X. I'm so bad about that. I'm not the best like social media person to find, but I'm working on it. This is new for me. But you can find me at the Lydian coin, because my name is Lydia, and the Lydian was the first coin in Europe, the first, and arguably we think that it was a market-based money, so not a government-derived money. So I'm very, that was a fortuitous thing in my own profession. So you can find us there, but definitely go at AIER on X as well. Find us, and we'll be producing content. I hope to do some video content and other things that help give short informational bursts to help people understand these, what I like to call complex, not complicated issues of monetary policy.
So on the spot now, today, perhaps the first to do so as a former Ron Paul staffer, will you categorically endorse Ron Paul as the next chairman of the Fed in 2026?
I don't think he would take it. He doesn't like to get on a plane. He really likes his home in Lake Jackson.
Can he just fly up once, shut it down, and then go back to Texas?
I suppose he could try. I also would like to keep him, though. I don't know if people. I'm not sure what kind of ire he would get by doing that. But I wouldn't be opposed. I'll put it that way.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate being with you.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the conversation, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and also ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to know more about Free the People, go to freethepeople.org.